Hi, Matt Sinclair. Today I want to talk about microchips, the government's plan to subsidise the UK semiconductor industry, and how we might think about security in globalised high-tech industries. Along the way, I'll share a few facts about just how amazingly sophisticated this industry has become, which, as well as being cool, I think is a vital part of the context here. The industry's in the headlines partly because of the ongoing strategic competition between the United States and China. The latest example is there on the left. Obviously, there's been a lot going on in recent years, but also because the UK government's announced a package of interventions, really, trying to support the industry here in the UK, support its growth, and some have attacked it on the basis: is it good enough? Is the amount of money attached big enough, more than anything? I'm not going to try and answer that question in this video. There's a lot that go into properly answering that question, but I do think we should challenge ourselves to ask the right questions about this sort of intervention, and that's really what I wanted to kind of focus on today. So I've just finished reading a book on the history of the chip industry, Chip War by Chris Miller, and so because this is not my core area of expertise, I'll be quoting that book pretty liberally as we go along. I'd recommend it for anyone who wants to get their head into the public policy challenges in this area, or just finds this kind of business history fascinating. I don't know if it's consciously modelled on The Prize by Daniel Yergin, which is a very famous must-read history of the oil industry, but does a similar job of both telling this really cool business story and making the link to wider events, bigger sort of strategic questions. I disagree a little on some parts of the public policy diagnosis. I'll come back to that later, but I'd absolutely recommend the book. So before we get into the public policy, I do think it's important to start with just how amazing the modern microchip industry and its work has become. Because I think that helps us understand this is not an industry which is going to be susceptible to some kind of old-fashioned remedies. So the chips might be made in Taiwan by TSMC, based on a design by American tech brand, using tools made by the Dutch company ASML, among others. But there's a whole load of amazing tech that makes those companies' work possible. So I'll give two examples. First, how you make the light that is used in the most sophisticated modern photolithography. This is part of how you kind of get the integrated circuit onto these chips at a tiny scale. So that uses a thing called EUV light. And the first challenge there is how you make the light itself. And it talks about how it's done here. Tiny balls of tin fired through a vacuum and getting shot by a laser. To an unbelievable degree, the sort of degrees of exacting industrial process to get the light itself. And that's by a company called Cyma, based in the US, owned by that Dutch company ASML. Once you've got that light, and there's a whole other kind of bleeding edge technology in the laser involved there, but once you've got that light, you need to focus it. And that's where the lens comes in. So Zeiss, a German group, creating unbelievably smooth mirrors, the smoothest objects ever made. And I think some of the facts about these things absolutely just unbelievable. So scaled to the size of Germany, their biggest irregularities would be 1/10 of a millimeter. Like unbelievably smooth lenses to target the light that's generated in this already pretty remarkable process. And all of this going into the machines used to create modern microchips. So given all that, and why I think that context is important, we need to remember that semiconductor success is hard and not necessarily something you can reliably buy. And the book, I think, speaks to this with two big examples. First, how Intel stumbles. I mean, obviously, you wouldn't bet against them coming back. They're still an enormous part of the industry, but creating an opening for TSMC and Samsung, now maybe on the recovery. Second, China trying to create its own semiconductor supply chain with enormous resources of all kinds, but finding it very challenging. And The reason why I think it's fundamentally hard is firstly that success depends on some big bets. So e.g. kind of integrated chip making where, as big chunks of the process are brought together in a single business versus TSMC in Taiwan acting as a manufacturer for fabless design firms, often in the United States. Now, it wasn't obvious that an integrated approach, with all of the synergies that brings, wouldn't be better. I think, I'm sure you can look at it and see and explain why it's better now. But that's a discovery process. People, it's not obvious how that's going to turn out. And these are quite fundamental questions where it's hard for individual companies to choose a middle path. They do, to some extent, need to decide a route. Are we going to be an integrated manufacturer? Are we going to be, fabless manufacturer for other people's designs? It's quite hard to do both because people worry about the incentives it creates. Some companies do, or will try to do both. It's not to say it can't succeed, but there's some difficult, big decisions. And secondly, success depends on this massive network of suppliers. You try and do it all alone. It doesn't just mean building one capability. It means building a whole host of capabilities right at the technology frontier. And a business or a country that wants to be truly self-sufficient is likely to pay a significant price, be less competitive, because it's going to be bad at some or many of those things. So in that world, what can we do? What does success look like? I think success looks like having a broad swathe of friendly countries hosting, competing but cooperating through supply chains companies working on this problem, each bringing their own strengths, their own approaches. Autarky wouldn't just mean falling behind, and it would create its own very real strategic risk because you'd have too few bets on too few businesses with too great a chance of failure. And I think in that light, the relatively liberal policy the US took, which allowed the industry to grow in South Korea, grow in Taiwan, didn't try to sort of police it all back onto home soil, has done a bit better than its critics, including to some extent Chris Miller in the book, allow. It created an environment where, it didn't mean that US industry couldn't stumble, but it meant that when it stumbled, the baton was picked up for that for a time by firms in friendly nations. And it meant that the US could keep its preeminence in the parts of the supply chain where it still was right at the frontier. And it meant that it could keep a strategic grip on the industry through friendly nations. So from a national security perspective, you've still got the win. And now that doesn't mean there aren't specific issues around, let's say, protecting intellectual property from hostile actors. But I don't think we should see the current outcome, at least, as a great failure. Of course, we don't know how it's going to proceed in the future. But I think for now, there's more to be said for the open approach that the US has taken than I think some people give it credit for. And the alternatives of plowing money into trying to create a closed loop could be a lot worse. Even the disruptions seen during COVID, which many people might have seen and thought, well, this is the industry going wrong. I think Miller makes a pretty persuasive case that actually the supply chain responded really well. They made more chips. What happened was the demand fluctuated enormously, and that demand, with industries cutting back, then expanding, some industries cutting back demand for some chips, expanding demand for other chips. That demand was suddenly very unstable, and that led to supply chain problems. But the actual chip industry came through those huge disruptions really incredibly well. So all of that means, that even if there's some hard science and specific industry details here where I'm not the right person to ask, you want to talk to proper chip industry experts, I think we can think clearly about the right questions for the kind of intervention the UK has announced. What I don't think we should be doing is asking about whether or not we should really be getting too lost in to what extent is UK domestic capacity owning the whole supply chain or all of the critical elements in it. I think it's unrealistic. I just don't think it's guide to what we want to achieve. And I don't think our goal should generally be thought about in terms of beating our allies, putting in more subsidy than the EU or the US. That ultimately we're going to be working with them as often as we'll be competing with them. And to the extent that we're competing, we'll be competing in specific segments. And that's where we need to ask is, does the UK industry have the infrastructure, the scientific base, the skill base that it needs to prosper? I think, there does need to be scrutiny of announcements like this, but I think I'd focus on different questions. Firstly, as always, is this addressing a legitimate market failure, right? I think you want to be making sure that we're targeting any support in areas where there's a role for government. Scientific research would be your classic example where there might be an undersupply of a public good. Otherwise, I think there's a huge risk that the money becomes a transfer more than achieving very much. Secondly, are we doing our bit to contribute to the broader work of delivering the highest quality chips with other friendly nations? There will be competition in segments, but at a macro public policy level, I think we should think about this more like, say, like our contributions to the war in Ukraine. Are we doing our bit than some kind of struggle where our goal is to beat the EU or beat the US or beat Taiwan? I think another question I'd ask is, are the subsidies or other interventions well matched to the needs of the segments in the semiconductor industry we're talking about in question? So fabs, where these chips are kind of the big factories where these chips are made, they need big chunky like dollar investments, whether that's tax breaks or some other form of support. The kind of work the UK does more often, maybe it's going to be more spring out of research efforts in the science establishment. Maybe it's going to be about how we create the right skill base. Maybe it's going to be about infrastructure. Maybe it's going to be about energy costs. But I think looking just at the dollar amounts for different the headline dollar amounts is probably the wrong question. And finally, are we thinking serious about other barriers to success in the UK? Because don't remember, of course, the semiconductor business is still a business with all of the concerns that affect other businesses. So they'll need to think: is this where their workforce wants to live? Is this where will they get to keep a share of the earnings that are return on all the investment they put into this? You wouldn't want to have the best semiconductor policy in the world and undermine that by hiking business taxes, for example. So I have not answered all these questions, but I do think it is good to step back on industries like this and just ask what are the right questions and what's the standard we should be looking to hold public policy to? Because any program needs effective scrutiny, but a sophisticated, diverse supply chain like semiconductors, you want to be focusing on where is the UK playing, to what extent, where are its existing strengths, and where might there be a legitimate role for public policy to help the UK do its bit alongside countries like, from the US to the Netherlands to Taiwan to South Korea, who are going to continue to be a part of this story going forward. I hope that was interesting. I hope it made sense. Any thoughts, questions, do let me know down in the comments below. Please like and subscribe, and I look forward to speaking to you next time.